All right, let's go ahead and get started. Let's come to order and go on the record, please. I'm Charlotte Mitchell, Chair of the Utilities Commission. With me this morning are the following commissioners. When I call your name, please announce your presence. Commissioner Brown Bland.
I'm present. Good morning.
Good morning. Commissioner Gray.
Here.
Commissioner Klefelter.
Yes, good morning.
Commissioner Duffley.
Good morning.
Commissioner Hughes.
Good morning.
And Commissioner McKissick.
Good morning.
In compliance with State Government Ethics Act, I remind members of the Commission of their duty to avoid conflicts of interest and inquire at this time as to whether any member of the Commission has a known conflict with respect to matters coming before us this morning. The record will reflect that no conflicts have been identified, so we'll go ahead and get started. All right. House Bill 951 directs the Commission to take all reasonable steps to achieve reductions in the emissions of carbon dioxide in this state from electric generating facilities owned or operated by Duke Energy Progress and Duke Energy Carolinas. The Commission is directed to develop by December 31st, 2022, a plan, which we've referred to as the Carbon Plan, to achieve the targeted emissions reductions and to review the plan every 2 years thereafter. The Commission has ordered Duke to file a proposed carbon plan by no later than May 16th of this year. House Bill 951 requires that the development of the carbon plan includes stakeholder input. The Commission has further ordered Duke to conduct at least 3 stakeholder meetings prior to May 13th, 2022. The first of these meetings occurred on January 25th, 2022, and was facilitated by the Great Plains Institute. To further the goal of keeping the Commission apprised of the sufficiency of the stakeholder process, we are here this morning to receive an update on that first stakeholder meeting. We'll start with an update from Duke, which should not exceed 10 minutes. Following Duke's update, we'll take questions from commissioners if there are any. Next, we'll proceed with the public staff and hear from the public staff its views, which should not exceed 5 minutes, and we'll follow with commission questions if there are any. The Commission is also allowing interveners in this proceeding who have pre-registered to do so to update the Commission on the sufficiency of that first stakeholder meeting. Each intervener update should not exceed 5 minutes and will be followed by questions from the commissioners if there are any. The interveners that have pre-registered to provide an update are the Clean Power Suppliers Association, the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association, and Appalachian Voices, and the interveners will be taken in that order. I note that NCSEA filed a letter with the Commission in this docket on February 1st, in which it indicated that it was providing the letter in lieu of presenting to the Commission this morning. The commissioners have reviewed the letter and will proceed straight to commissioner questions for NCSEA when I call upon NCSEA. All right, finally, I want to stress that the sole purpose of the updates that we will receive this morning is to inform the commissioners of the sufficiency of the stakeholder process. Parties are directed to limit their updates to the sufficiency of the stakeholder process and should not address any substantive issues this morning. Just one last time to make sure we're all on the same page. Please limit discussion to sufficiency of the stakeholder process. If you all stray from sufficiency of the stakeholder process, do not be surprised when I direct you to get back in your lane. All right, with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to call upon Duke. And Duke, for the record, please announce, you can make your appearance, announce by stating your name and letting us know your title and your role in the carbon plan proceeding.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Mr. Durack. There you are.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Chair Mitchell, Commissioners, for this chance to present to you this morning on the sufficiency of the stakeholder process. We do appreciate this chance to present with you. And with a 10-minute shot clock, I'm going to try to get out of the way very quickly, and we'll turn things over immediately to Rebecca Doolin. Rebecca is a recovering regulatory attorney, but in her prior role with Duke as an attorney, developed a wealth of experience in IRP planning processes in the Carolinas in front of both commissions, and brings an immense amount of expertise to bear on these issues, and also has strong relationships with many of the key stakeholders that are involved in regulatory processes in the Carolinas. So we're thrilled to have her in her new role as Director of Stakeholder Engagement, and I will turn things over to her. Thank you.
All right, so far so good, Mr. Durack. Ms. Doolin, you may proceed. Glad to have you in your new capacity.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you, Jack. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. As Jack said, I'm Rebecca Doolin, and I'm leading the company's stakeholder engagement efforts for the Carolinas Carbon Plan. My comments today are entirely limited to the sufficiency of the process, and so thank you for that reminder. I have not appeared before the Commission before this Commission, so it truly is a pleasure to be with you this morning. First and foremost, the companies appreciate the leadership of this Commission in providing us guidance on the stakeholder process for the carbon plan. We believe that Duke has a strong recent track record of working cooperatively with stakeholders towards achieving consensus on complex issues. And we're committed to ensuring the carbon plan stakeholder process follows the path of those previous successes and fulfills the Commission's directives and those of House Bill 951 regarding the need for stakeholder input. Duke has worked to create a robust, open, transparent process through which stakeholders may provide input into the development of the proposed carbon plan. We take this work very seriously and have dedicated significant company resources and time to provide a thoughtful and meaningful approach to engaging with stakeholders on this very important work. One of the first steps that we took when initiating this effort was to hire a third-party consultant, the Great Plains Institute, to help guide the development of the stakeholder process and to facilitate the discussions with stakeholders. This work is led by Doug Scott, who has a very interesting and robust background. He's the former chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission. He's also the former head of the Illinois EPA, and he's also served as a mayor and a legislator. So he brings a really broad perspective to this work. GPI has also worked on decarbonization efforts in other parts of the country, and so we believe they bring an informed and fresh perspective to working with stakeholders in North Carolina and South Carolina on the company's energy transition. Now, on to our first stakeholder meeting, as Chair Mitchell mentioned, it was held on January 25th, and we brought over 350 stakeholders to the virtual table. Those 350 stakeholders, and the list of all of those is provided in the report that we filed last week. Those stakeholders represented over 150 different organizations and seemingly every facet of stakeholder interest. We think this great turnout is certainly a reflection of the immense interest in the energy transition in general, and also in the carbon plan specifically. But we also think this great turnout is driven in part by our efforts to notify stakeholders of the meeting, which we did through a variety of ways, through filings with this commission, through our targeted website that we have developed for this initiative, and also through specific outreach by both GPI and Duke. Interestingly, our current list of stakeholders includes over 650 individuals. The first meeting was designed to address both the needs of stakeholders who wanted to understand or discuss the bigger picture of the carbon plan, and also the needs of those stakeholders who wanted to hear more about the technical modeling underlying the development of the plan. And so we dedicated the first half of the meeting to discuss these higher level process related topics, and then the second half of the meeting to discuss more of the technical topics. Now, I would say I expected that we would lose maybe a fair amount of stakeholders once we took a lunch break and then dove into some of the more technical topics. But I was quite surprised and impressed with the number of attendees that were still with us through the depths of the technical topics. Stakeholders had an opportunity to provide feedback to us at any time through the WebEx chat feature, and specific portions of the meeting were dedicated to allowing stakeholders to provide verbal feedback. Now, this town hall style format of these meetings is necessary to ensure all stakeholders can participate, but this approach doesn't necessarily lend itself to a more in-depth conversation whereby we can drill down on some of the important technical pieces of the carbon plan development. And this dynamic was observed by certain stakeholders. So to address this, we're scheduling 3 additional working group meetings on topics that garnered significant interest. For example, the topic of the solar interconnection forecast is one that stakeholders gave us specific feedback on that they would like to have a deeper dive on. So we will be holding those meetings on February 18th, and communication about those meetings will be sent to stakeholders in the next few days. These upcoming meetings will be dedicated to specific topics with a more limited group of technical experts who are invited to actively participate. And this effort is in response to the feedback we received from stakeholders, and we think will further the company's goal of obtaining meaningful input to inform the development of the Carolinas Carbon Plan. And I would note that in this situation where we are creating a working group that's targeted towards specific stakeholders, we also will ensure that all stakeholders have the opportunity to listen in to these meetings. Now, taking a step back as to the plans for the larger stakeholder meetings, the next large stakeholder meetings are scheduled for February 23rd and then subsequently for March 22nd. I wanted to just briefly address some of the other feedback we've heard from stakeholders regarding the process. And I also want to emphasize that we really appreciate the feedback. We really hope stakeholders will continue to bring the feedback to us with regard to the process, because it helps us make it better. And so the request regarding the need to receive agendas and presentations and other information in advance, we certainly appreciate this practical comment and understand the interest from stakeholders in obtaining these materials earlier. While we were not able to provide this for our initial meeting, we are committed to providing these materials in advance for future meetings. Stakeholders have also asked what will happen with the unanswered questions that were raised in the first meeting. And we actually received over 550 comments and questions in the WebEx chat during the first meeting. And we tried to get to as many of them as we could. Of course, it was not possible to get to all of them. And so since that time, we've been working to group the questions together by topic and subject matter, and plan to address many of them at the beginning of the next stakeholder meeting on February 23rd. I'd also just generally mention with regard to the questions that I don't believe we'll be able to answer each and every question in this that has been raised in the stakeholder process, because frankly, we don't have the answers to all of the questions yet. And also, I don't feel like it's appropriate for Duke to come into the stakeholder process with all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed. The process is intended to garner stakeholder input that will then inform the analysis needed to develop the carbon plan. And I'll just close by saying we are very pleased with the level of stakeholder engagement in the first meeting, and we believe we're off to a very positive start in creating a framework for stakeholders in North Carolina and South Carolina to provide input to inform the company's development of the initial Carolinas carbon plan. We understand and we believe that the stakeholder process must remain flexible and evolve as we gain more experience and respond to more suggestions from stakeholders. So in sum, we look forward to continuing to work with a broad and diverse group of stakeholders as we develop a proposed plan to achieve a cleaner energy future that's reliable and affordable for our customers. And that concludes my remarks, Chair Mitchell. Commissioners, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Doolin. Let me check in with the commissioners to see if you all have questions for Duke. I can't see each of you on my screen at this point, so if you do have a question, please just call out.
Chair Mitchell, I have 1 or 2 quick questions.
All right, please proceed, Commissioner McKissick.
Sure, and it's my understanding that essentially you're going to have some smaller breakout groups. Is that what I'm understanding?
Commissioner McKissick, we've lost your audio, Commissioner McKissick. Commissioner McKissick, can you hear me? Commissioner McKissick, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, we lost your audio
Oh, you
about
did?
halfway
Sorry.
into your question. So why don't you please ask the question again?
Sure. I'm just curious, when it comes to these specific issues where stakeholders have unique interests, such as the solar interconnection process, are you planning to hold kind of subgroups to focus in on those unique areas of interest? And secondly, is it envisioned that all of the meetings that are taking place are going to be virtual? Are you also planning to hold any live meetings to exchange information?
Jack, I was going to proceed unless you want to
Yeah,
comment.
please do. Please do. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks. Thanks, Commissioner McKissick. Yes, you're correct. We are planning to have smaller working groups on subtopics that have garnered significant attention from stakeholders. I don't believe we'll be able to create a subgroup for every topic that stakeholders are particularly interested in, but we've started with 3 topics that based on feedback that we received from stakeholders. And so those will be the meetings we'll be proceeding with on February 18th in a smaller format, as I described. And as to the question about the virtual versus in-person,
Yes.
right now we're planning to do everything virtually. If the circumstances change, certainly we began this at the height of Omicron, and so the February 25th meeting needed to be all virtual. If circumstances evolve to allow for some in-person participation, my goodness, certainly that would be ideal, but there will always be a virtual option, and I think it just depends on how the current circumstances with the pandemic progress as to whether an in-person option will be viable or not.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, thanks, Commissioner McKissick. Any additional questions from commissioners for Duke? All right, I'm not hearing any. Ms. Doolin, I do have a few for you. You mentioned that Great Plains Institute is facilitating the discussions. Can you talk for a minute just why Great Plains, what their background is, what that organization brings to this process?
Sure, absolutely. So the Great Plains Institute is based they do primarily work in the Midwest. We reached out to a number of potential facilitators and liked that the Great Plains Institute has not done work in the Carolinas before, so where it could create a challenge for them to become up to speed as quickly as possible on all the interests of our stakeholders. They also brought a really unique and new perspective to the issues that we're dealing with in the Carolinas. They also have been working on similar efforts with regard to various states or regions' decarbonization plans. Happy to provide you a few examples if that helps. I think we really were interested in Doug Scott's perspective as well, having been the chair of the Illinois Commerce Commission and also the head of the EPA, and some other parts of his background that we thought would be helpful to bringing a new look at things in the Carolinas. So that was primarily what drove us to just really bringing in someone brand new to help guide the discussions.
Okay, thanks for that additional explanation. That's helpful. You mentioned in your comments that you all have reviewed the feedback that that has been received so far on that first process, and some of the suggestions that the participants have made, including circulating materials in advance. And you indicated that Duke is prepared to do that, to satisfy some of the requests that have been made of you all. One of the sort of in reading through the materials that have been provided to us so far, what struck me is that stakeholders would like to know that information and as far in advance as possible so that they can be sure to have the correct personnel at the meetings. So I'm glad to hear Duke say it's going to get those materials out as early as possible, and hope that you all continue to push to get those out there as soon as you can, so that the right people are at the meetings and they can be as productive as possible. I also heard you say, you can correct me if I didn't hear you correctly, but I heard you say that you all received 550 questions. I think that's combination of chat and discussion. Is that right? Or was that 550 in chat alone?
That's 550 comments and questions
Okay.
in the chat. So some of that is dialogue form with someone weighing in and then another party weighing in. So I wouldn't say 550 unique issues, but 550 comments and questions, from stakeholders, and that's in the chat box.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, to me, 550 sort of, even if you're, that's a significant amount of material that was likely in that, in your chat box at the end of the meeting. And I heard you say you all have been working through that material and sort of organizing and sorting into topics, so that you can address that going forward. Has the company considered putting on its website responses to those questions, or figuring out a way to address more quickly than perhaps the next stakeholder session, the questions that have been asked? And is that in the works, or is that a possibility?
Yes, so we did in the meeting address as many questions as we could, and that is part of Great Plains facilitation of the meeting, is where there are questions that could go ahead, either quickly be answered, clarifying questions that could quickly be answered, or questions that would come up for discussion. Then as much of those that could be raised from the chat in the meeting itself were raised. So that was the beginning step. Of course, that doesn't come close to getting through 550. And so putting them, we do have a dedicated website. We have currently some frequently asked questions that are there, and we may be able to evolve that to group some of the topics together, and where stakeholders seem to have, a real interest, and we have the ability to be able to provide answers to those on the website. Then I think it makes sense to build out that frequently asked questions portion of the website and provide feedback as quickly as we can. Understand the need to provide feedback more quickly than 3 or 4 weeks later. So that's something that we certainly can look at and can report back to you in future meetings on.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. I also heard you say that some of the questions asked, the companies didn't have answers to at this time. That makes sense to me. And so I hope that in the company's endeavors to address questions going down the road, looking down the road in the future, you all can point out questions that have been asked that you all are later able to address, if that makes sense. Just being responsive to the questions that you all have been asked throughout the entirety of the process.
Chair Mitchell, if I could, I'd just add there's a tension here, obviously, in the stakeholder process. First and foremost, our focus is on getting input. So, where questions are raised on particular topics, we're trying to do the best we can to say, if we don't have the answer, or if we're not prepared to give the answer, because we're still in the process of doing the analysis, we still want to hear from stakeholders. What is your view on how this issue should be handled, or what is your view on this particular input in the process? So I agree with everything Rebecca said. We'll continue to evolve the ways in which we can try to give answers, but certainly won't be possible in every circumstances, in large part because the point of this initiative is for us to get the thoughts from others and use that to inform how we develop the carbon plan. So
Okay.
it's a balance that we're trying to figure out as we go through this, for sure.
All right. Thank you for that additional explanation, Mr. Jurak. All right. With that, I do not have anything further for Duke. Appreciate the update, Ms. Doolin and Mr. Jurak. I'll check in one last time with commissioners to see if there's anything further for Duke before we move on to the public staff. All right, well, thanks to both of you, and we will turn now to the public staff.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Nadia Lohr with the public staff. And with me also is Jeff Thomas, who will be available in case the commission has any questions that he can help with. So the public staff attended the first stakeholder meeting on January 25th, along with approximately 150 organizations, as well as members of the public. Technical experts with Duke Energy presented a large amount of information, which was helpful in creating a baseline of knowledge as the stakeholder group begins the process of providing input on the carbon plan. The public staff recommends several improvements to the stakeholder process, and many of these recommendations are already being addressed, as we heard from Ms. Doolin in her update just a few minutes ago. But I'll go ahead and go through what the public staff has put together. So first, we believe that it would be helpful for Duke to provide a more detailed agenda further in advance of the next two meetings. It would also be helpful for Duke to provide attendees with the presentation slides and any other materials that will be discussed in advance of each stakeholder meeting, so that there's adequate time for participants to review those materials beforehand. Duke should also share inputs and other data with stakeholders as soon as possible, subject to any necessary non-disclosure agreements. We also think that there is great value in conducting working groups that can go more in depth on certain technical issues. And it sounds like Duke has started planning those, so that's great. And lastly, stakeholders should be able to submit questions or suggestions to Duke prior to each stakeholder meeting, so that Duke can either respond during the meeting or provide a written response. And in addition, Duke should be required to respond in writing to all substantive questions and suggestions that are put forward either during the meetings or in advance of the meetings. So the public staff believes that with the adoption of these recommendations, the stakeholder process will be more productive and result in a stronger final carbon plan. And that concludes our update.
All right, thank you, Ms. Lohr. Let me check in with commissioners to see if there are questions for the public staff. Commissioners, questions for Ms. Lohr or Mr. Thomas? All right, Ms. Lohr, I do have a question for you. I very much appreciate the public staff's feedback here and participation in the stakeholder proceedings. I did hear Duke touch on many of the recommendations the public staff has made, and expect that your recommendations will be accepted by the companies and carried out by the companies. The one recommendation I'm curious about is the data and model inputs, and I think you said subject to non-disclosure agreements where it's appropriate to do that. Do you anticipate that being an issue in the working groups? I mean, at what point in the process do you see the discussion going into data and model inputs?
And Jeff can help me out here as well. I expect that will happen likely fairly soon in the working groups. However, I will say that several participants in the last stakeholder meeting did indicate that they were interested in or undertaking some modeling of their own, and that would be where, you know, they would need those inputs and data as soon as possible so they could start working on some modeling. But Jeff, do you have any input on timing?
Sure, yeah, this is Jeff Thomas with the public staff, and I can just provide a little bit more on a perspective. I think that outside of a few very high level technical data points, the larger groups are probably too many people and too much to do to dig into the actual numbers. So I would expect the smaller, more focused working groups, hopefully to be able to actually review some pertinent data points and discuss where those are coming from, how they were developed or modified for North Carolina. And then if there are other competing data sources that interveners would like to have be considered, that would kind of be at that time, but it would be more focused. So you might have one working group on transmission costs and some of the assumptions there. You might have another that focuses on renewable costs and operating characteristics and inputs. So kind of being able to narrow the field of inputs, of which there are hundreds, will be helpful in the smaller groups. Sorry.
Chair Mitchell, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, y'all. I was just saying thank you, Mr. Thomas, for that clarification and that follow-up. That's helpful. We'll continue to check in with at the next update on how this is going and you know, whether the parties and the extent to which parties are able to utilize Duke's information to you know, to conduct their own analysis. I want to ask, and this question is probably directed at Ms. Lohr. You know, one of the benefits of a stakeholder process is that they can involve groups not necessarily always represented at the commission, or you know, sort of that a group beyond simply the regular participants in commission proceedings. You know, clearly just from the numbers of participants, you know, there were many participants here, but is it the public staff's impression that Duke was able to reach some of its customer groups that aren't necessarily always represented here at the commission?
I believe so, Chair Mitchell. The list of organizations, you know, there were around 150 organizations. There were many that we haven't seen here before in front of the commission. So I think that through their outreach, they were able to reach a lot of those stakeholders.
Okay. All right. Ms. Lohr, thank you for that. All right, let me check in with commissioners one more time to see if any questions for the public staff before we let them go. Commissioner Duffley?
Just one question about, you mentioned that you would like to see Duke allow the submission of questions prior to the meetings and then have all of the responses in writing. In Duke's presentation, I heard them state that possibly there would not be questions or answers to some of those questions. Or are you requesting, I'm just trying to clarify what you're requesting, if they don't have an answer, you want it in writing that they don't have an answer at the time?
That's correct. That would be helpful. You know, either responding directly to a question or stating that they don't have an answer at that time would be what we're looking for. Just an acknowledgement of the question and their response to it. And it's understandable at this point in the development of the plan that they don't have all those answers. So yes.
Okay, thank you. I don't have anything further.
Okay,
Chair
thank
Mitchell,
you. Yes, ma'am. Please proceed, Commissioner Brown-Bland.
I had a question related to the same recommendation that Commissioner Duffley questioned. And that is, and Ms. Lohr, you may not have a precise answer at this time, but maybe something to think about. And my question is, to the extent that you want answers of all questions that are submitted, we see a great deal of interest. We've already seen in the chat, you know, over 500 questions. I expect that will likely grow. And we all know all things digital get extremely you know, voluminous, and we pick up a lot of things. So have you, in making that recommendation, are there any thoughts to be had around organizing principles for how Duke might go about gathering all of that and responding? Is there an expected time frame? Did your recommendation indicate you would like a response prior to the meeting? You know, just how would it be handled for efficiency and keep the process moving, going, um, um, you know, and generally that, I think you pick up the gist, just how to corral all of that and make a response to everything. Is that what we need in this to make the stakeholder process all that it can be?
I think you're correct in that it would be, it's a complicated task because questions are coming in during the stakeholder meetings, and as I just recommended, it would be nice for questions to be able to come in ahead of the stakeholder meetings as well. So there is the potential for, of course, many questions and suggestions. One way to handle this could be a online portal for people to be able to submit these questions and suggestions, and that could create an orderly method for responses. And I believe Ms. Doolin mentioned that they are actually going through now and grouping some of the questions they received during the first stakeholder meeting. And I think that's a great way to organize responses as well. As if they're receiving a lot of questions on the same topic, it would make sense to put those all together and respond to them in the same response. So, I think there is an organizational challenge, but I think that through some of those, maybe a portal, maybe grouping responses, that can be streamlined.
This is Jeff Thomas. If I just add very quickly, one model we were kind of thinking of when we were considering this was the CPRE, the Competitive Procurement of Renewable Energy. They have multiple stakeholder meetings where there's chat and there's questions asked during the meeting, but there's also an online portal where any member can go and kind of formally ask a question that everyone else can see, and the response is publicly posted for everyone to see, which might also help cut down on some repetitive questions that, themes that are hit again and again. We just thought that could be a potential model here.
All right, thank you. That's very helpful.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Brown-Bland. Any additional questions for the public staff? All right.
Chair Mitchell, this is Jack Drake. I apologize. As we've explored these issues more, I would love to maybe have a little chance to give some additional thoughts on this, if that's appropriate, and I'm glad to do that now or later, or kind of put it to the next time we get together. But just as we've explored, I think if we've gone to more specifics around what these processes are and what they're not, more so than we were discussing when we were presenting, I think there's some ideas that we would like to kind of put in front of you on those topics as well. So defer to you when the right time is for that.
All right, Mr. Drake, just so I'm clear, are you saying you want to respond you have response directly to questions that Commissioners Duffley and Brown-Bland asked of the public staff?
Yeah, well, more specifically, would like to just share a few more general thoughts on the idea of how the question process we see fitting in the stakeholder process.
All right, go ahead and proceed, and it seems like this will be helpful information for everybody here, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate this is a bit of a new territory for all of us. I think I would just say first of all, as you think about the range of activities we engage in the regulatory process, there's the fully litigated proceeding, which we're not in yet, and then there's the stakeholder process. I think generally our view is the stakeholder process should be and feel and look different than once we get into the full litigated process. And for context, in the IRP process in the Carolinas, we received more than 3,000 data requests around our filings, and we answered each and every one of those. But I will tell you, it was a dedicated team of dozens, if not more than 100 Duke employees required to sort through 3,000 plus data requests in a litigated IRP proceeding. And so our view is, if we want the stakeholder process to be something different than that, and I think we do, we want to accomplish something different in the stakeholder process. It can't be that it becomes just like the intensity level discovery like that happens in the context of litigated proceeding. We're We know that is going to be part of this process, but we're not there yet. And so, again, as we said before, our focus is on receiving input. We want to hear from stakeholders what they think we should do, what assumptions we should make. And that's, again, what we're going to focus on the working groups is, okay, here's something we're going to have, here's a set of things we're going to have to assume for modeling purposes. You tell us what assumptions you think we should make. To the extent we are leaning towards a particular input or assumption about an input, we'll share that with you all and we'll dialogue about it. But again, to the earlier point, we don't have all the answers. So there's questions we can't answer because we haven't finished the analysis. We don't have a final answer on this assumption or that input. But more generally, we don't have the resources to both run the stakeholder process, do all the work that's going to be required to get us to a May 16th filing, and then respond to discovery-like data request type questions in this process. So what we're trying to do is thread the needle and give responses at a high level where we have the information. But I think the reality is that from our view, the stakeholder process is not intended to turn into a discovery-like process, nor do we think that's the best use of our time, because again, frankly, thinking about the level of questions we could get, we received in one stakeholder process, if you multiply that times 2 meetings plus 3 other stakeholder subgroup meetings, we could quickly be approaching the 3,000 plus data request type discovery questions that we just don't have the resources. And I think, frankly, will inhibit our ability to do the work and to engage in the stakeholder process. So I'm not suggesting we have like the one answer for how we do this, and we recognize this, again, this is new territory for all of us. But I really want to be clear that from our vantage point, the kind of full-on written responses to every question submitted in the process is going to really inhibit the efficiency of what we think is the purpose of the stakeholder process.
All right, thank you, Mr. Durack, for that additional explanation. What I'm hearing from the company, from you, is that the company's focus has been on gathering and soliciting input from stakeholders, as opposed, and that remains the company's focus. So I have heard what you said. Let me check in to see if there is any follow-up, particularly from Commissioners Brown Bland, Duffley, any other commissioners on Mr. Durack's additional comments.
Chair Mitchell, I do have one question.
All right,
And that-
Commissioner McKissick.
That's simply this. I understand what Mr. Durack has stated. So I guess I pose this question to you. Obviously, there are going to be many duplicative questions that come along that would have essentially the same response. What was discussed earlier was some type of portal that might be created where you could go there and find the answers to questions that have been asked by others. Would it simplify that process if Duke tried to, what I would say, essentially take the essence of those questions, and rather than providing individual responses, provide a group and list of responses that generically covered specific topics and categories, as opposed to responding to each one individually, so that what a person might do is go back and look at this generic list that summarizes in substance what the questions amounted to, as opposed to always providing unique responses. I mean, in some instances, a unique response might be appropriate, but we're understanding that it's not a data request. That type of situation might come along later. But would that be a tool or a vehicle that might be workable? I'm just soliciting your thoughts about that. And, it just occurred to me as all this was unfolding and being discussed.
I think that's, Commissioner McKissick, thank you. I think that's a great question and a great framework for us to think about it. I definitely think that we could look to identify common themes in the questions and have a kind of FAQ type section on the website where some of those questions that we can answer, we can educate, can answer those types of questions. We could post those. So I think that's something we will definitely explore. And I don't see any reason why we couldn't try to do that where we have an answer to provide, obviously.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioner McKissick. Any additional questions for Mr. Durack? All right, before we let Ms. Lure go, any additional questions for Ms. Lure? Ms. Lure, we may have already let you go, and if so, I apologize, but I just want to make sure, nothing further for the public staff. Okay, next up, we will hear from the Clean Power Suppliers Association.
Thank you, Chair Mitchell. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Ben Snowden with the law firm of Fox Rothschild, and I'm here on behalf of the Clean Power Suppliers Association. CPSA is a nonprofit trade association whose members include developers of utility-scale solar facilities in the Carolinas. We want to thank the Commission for its active engagement in the stakeholder process and also for providing us an opportunity to present our views on the sufficiency of the process. CPSA very much appreciates Duke's efforts to reach out to stakeholders early in the process. In our view, it is clear that the company is taking this process seriously. As Ms. Doolin said, the first stakeholder meeting on the carbon plan focused on providing background information on HB 951 and the process for developing the carbon plan. It also included wide-ranging but generally high-level discussion of the data sources and modeling methodologies that Duke plans to use in devising the plan. Interested parties, as everyone has observed, had the opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback on all the materials presented. We believe that this approach was completely appropriate for an initial stakeholder meeting, and we also believe that Great Plains was an effective facilitator. We do have a few observations and recommendations about the process going forward, most of which have already been discussed in some way here. First, given the wide array of complex issues that are involved in formulating the initial carbon plan and the short time the Commission will have to consider those issues, we think it is critical that Duke strive to achieve consensus on as many issues as possible prior to filing a plan with the Commission. One thing that is essential in achieving any sort of consensus on major issues is that the companies be absolutely transparent early in the process about the inputs and the assumptions that they're using to formulate the carbon plan. CPSA echoes the recommendations from other parties that Duke provide written materials and agendas for stakeholder meetings well in advance of those meetings, and we're very happy to hear that Duke is committing to do that. In addition, we think it is essential that Duke share a draft of the carbon plan and allow time to incorporate feedback from stakeholders prior to filing its plan with the Commission. Stakeholders who are actively engaged in the process should not be surprised by anything they see in the carbon plan that gets filed. And finally, and I know this has been discussed, although it's appropriate for the initial stakeholder meeting to be high level, it is imperative that Duke begin the detailed technical engagement with stakeholders as soon as possible. We are glad to hear that Duke is setting up his working groups on technical subtopics. And our understanding based on the conversation and the response to Commissioner McKissick's question is that these are intended not just to be one-off meetings, but to kick off a deeper engagement on those issues. And we hope we understand that correctly. Now, just to be clear, nothing about Duke's efforts so far has been inconsistent with our recommendations. Duke has a huge task ahead of it, and the company has been working very hard on stakeholder engagement. We heard from Ms. Doolin this morning that Duke is already taking up some of the recommendations it's gotten from CPSA and other stakeholders. We think that is a great sign, and it's our hope that we stay on this trajectory as the process continues. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Snowden, thank you for your remarks this morning. Let me check in with commissioners to see if there are questions for Mr. Snowden. All right, Mr. Snowden, you are off the hook this morning. Thank you again for your time and for your recommendations. We will now call on NCSEA. I know that Mr. Smith, I believe, is here to respond to questions. Should the commissioners have any for NCSEA? Commissioners, any questions for Mr. Smith on comments filed by NCSEA? All right, I'm not hearing any questions from commissioners. Mr. Smith, there you are. I see you. Good morning, sir. All right, you're off the hook, Mr. Smith. Next up, I will call on Appalachian Voices. Ms. Crawley Jones, I see you.
Yes.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, please, ma'am.
Good morning, Chair Mitchell, commissioners and parties. My name is Kathy Crawley Jones. I'm with the Law Office of Brian Bryce, and I'm here as counsel for Intervenor Appalachian Voices. I had intended this morning just to be able to introduce Rory McElmore, the senior analyst with Appalachian Voices, to make a few comments, but unfortunately, he's had an unexpected illness in his family this morning and is not able to attend. And so in lieu of that appearance, we submitted just this morning to the commission written comments. Since those comments were just now filed, I would like to take just a couple of minutes to highlight a few points that are made there. And many of them have already been echoed today by other parties. Appalachian Voices has as a primary concern the inclusion of low-income minority voices as stakeholders in this process, and so would encourage a continued outreach to try and reach low and moderate income customers, Spanish-speaking communities, and other impacted stakeholders to ensure that those voices that may not have ready access to this process are engaged and heard. Appalachian Voices would also suggest that as these discussions are, these meetings are planned, that time be managed to allow for expanded question and answer time and discussion of the questions that are presented in the chat boxes. And it may be that this initial meeting was so information heavy, just trying to get the information out, that there was not time for feedback and discussion, but would hope that going forward that time be managed so that there is an opportunity to be prepared for and engage in stakeholder feedback during that process. We would also reiterate what other folks have said, that key to making this a conversation and an opportunity for stakeholder feedback, it is critical that materials are provided, and we would suggest at least 5 days prior to the meeting so that those materials can be digested and the right people can be part of that conversation. So we would highlight that suggestion that has been raised by public staff and others as well. And then finally, and this is along the question, the issue of the information that has come in through the chat box, is we know that the facilitators are trying to do the best they can to organize, to summarize, and to present that information in a more manageable format. However, it's impossible to do that without losing some of the context. And so question is raised is, can the information that's submitted in the chat box, and maybe this is through this other portal that's being suggested, be included and be made available as a sort of public record so everyone has access to that information, rather than just receiving and the commission receiving a distilled version that it's impossible to distill and summarize information without inserting some bias in there. And so to have access to those comments kind of in their form would allow people to refer to those comments and reiterate that without that kind of filter that comes through the summary process. But Appalachian Voices wants to reaffirm its commitment to this process and really appreciate the work of the parties and the commission to create a space where all stakeholders can work together towards a common goal of a carbon plan that serves all stakeholders. So we do appreciate that. Written comments in more detail were provided to the commission today.
All right, thank you, Ms. Crawley Jones, and thank you for your reacting sort of in real time to the situation with Mr. McElmoyle. Let me see if there are questions for you from the commissioners.
Chair Mitchell, just one question, I believe, maybe a second one. Ms. Jones, you raised the question about the inclusion of persons that are low and moderate income into this process. Do you have any recommendations for making that a more effective vehicle than what was done in the first meeting? I mean, are there any thoughts that you have about reaching out to those constituencies?
I need to discuss in more detail with Mr. McElmoyle kind of what has been thought of there, but I think one of the things that is inherently a boundary that's put up is if someone does not have high-speed internet access, they already lose access to these proceedings. And so, and I know some of this has been required because of COVID, but to have some opportunities for community meetings, in-person meeting, where folks are meeting to discuss what these issues are and how they impact communities. I think part of it is we just can't rely solely on everyone having WebEx and high-tech expertise. Because if we do, then there are going to be voices left out.
So your thoughts are essentially that if there were in-person meetings with certain, perhaps specific community groups, organizations, or even ones that would just broadly open to the community, it would be a mechanism that would allow for a higher degree of inclusivity as part of this process, just in relying upon virtual meetings.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And we'd be happy also if there are additional suggestions that Appalachian Voices can provide to the commission, we can supplement our comments for those particular suggestions.
Thank you.
Chair Mitchell.
Please proceed, Commissioner Brown Bland.
Thank you, Ms. Crawley-Jones, for your input and your comments and your thoughtfulness on the subject. The commission really wants some insight into knowing, what our role can be and how best to how to create for North Carolina a great stakeholder process, that we can use in this matter and many others. So to some extent, all this is experimental and a great learning opportunity. But you and several others are suggesting that Duke provide as far in advance what information they can about what's going to come up at a particular meeting. And I wonder how, for example, you suggested a 5-day, at least a 5-day notice of what's coming up and what will be presented. But I wonder whether if some sort of limit like that were imposed, how do you envision that being a limitation to discussion? So that if 3 days out, 2 days out, they think of something that's appropriate or, something else comes up, would you rather them not discuss it and not have that flexibility to bring it up? Would we be that strict about it, or would we maintain some flexibility in this process?
I think the flexibility is key. I mean, I would suggest that the intention is what's important. I'm sure there is an agenda that's put together, there's materials that put together, and if you have a hard deadline ahead of that to get as much information out as possible, that's going to be a better informed conversation. However, we all know that things come up between the last time you send it out, and I wouldn't want to limit the conversation, but to say as a goal, let's try and provide as much information ahead of time so that we can really make best use of our time together. Not trying to exclude what can be discussed, but just trying to empower people to have the information for the best use of time.
Thank you.
All right, any additional questions for Ms. Crawley-Jones? All right, not hearing any. So at this point, Ms. Crawley-Jones, thank you very much for your time and your remarks this morning. All right, with that, we have come to the end of at least the agenda for the morning. I want to thank you all again for your time and your thoughts and helping us, the commission, to remain informed about the process that is ongoing. I will pause here to see if there's any other point of business I need to consider before we adjourn.
Chair Mitchell, if I may.
All right, Mr. Durack.
We, again, appreciate all of the input we're receiving both in writing and in this meeting, and especially around how we can even improve the ways in which we're disseminating the opportunities to participate in these events. And so we continue to remain open to ideas on how to do that better, and appreciate that input. The one item I think I would want to just be really clear before we sign off on is the new idea was raised by CPSA for the first time that suggested we might provide a draft version of the carbon plan. And I would just say that for the reasons we outlined in our motion requesting additional time to get the carbon plan done, we think that's a fairly unreasonable request, and not one that will inhibit rather than facilitate more stakeholder engagement. So we're glad to talk about that more. We absolutely believe there's value in dialogue around inputs and even draft inputs and assumptions that Duke is considering using, and that's what the stakeholder process is for. But the notion that we will be able to have sufficient time to both do the stakeholder process thoughtfully and well, and produce a draft carbon plan in parallel with those efforts is in our view kind of untenable, not really consistent with the expectations the commission has set out so far. So we're going to keep dialoguing with parties on that. We want to hear perspectives, but just wanted that to be heard before we signed off for the day.
All right, thank you, Mr. Durack. We will take all of that under advisement, and again, appreciate the company's and all of the parties' time this morning. With that, if there is nothing else for our attention, we will be adjourned. Thank you very much, everybody.